Hi, no one. This is my practice for um, teaching about the IT, how to run an IT in our website. And let's start. So probably I should share the screen. This is the screen I'm going to share here. And right away, we see a manager file. I'll remind you what the manager file is. Manager file is the manager file. It defines all the tasks that participants will complete in the study and also defines the sequence of this task and can also define stuff like I usually use it also to randomly choose conditions between different conditions. Here, for instance, there is a dummy condition because the workshop IAT study doesn't have any between participants condition, but if it had, we could do something like that. And these two lines of code, I chose either cond1 or cond2, and here I put that in the another variable called params, and that variable I will send to the server, so I will be able to see in my data what condition it was. And also, usually, if there was any meaning to the condition, I would add that here to the global, because here what you can see in API.addGlobal is that we add global variables, which means variables that all the tasks can read later. And currently what we add here is the URL for where the images are. In this study, the images are always under this path. Also, how many minutes the study has, because a couple of different tasks will use that to tell participants this study will take about 9 minutes. And here I also define the categories for the IAT. It's really, I don't really have to do it here, but let's say that there will be a few different files that we need to know what the category names are. It's good to put it here. And then I define tasks. And this is api.addTasksSet. It's a function that defines what tasks we have in the manager. And later I will use those tasks when I create sequence. In general, you don't really need that. You can just define everything right away in the sequence, but I prefer to do it that way for a few reasons I cannot get into right now. So here are just all the tasks, and they are defined like this. And I'm not going to show you how we define all the tasks. Probably that will come later. But here is what I want to show you is the definition of the IAT. So we say it's type time. We don't have many types. We have, if you look above here, so for instance, when we defined the questionnaire, it was type quest. Quest is the type of task that we use for questionnaires. We also have type message. So message just shows instructions usually, just it shows information. And the third kind of task that we have is time. And time is for reaction time tasks. And Elad will tell you all about how to program reaction time tasks in this Minno time. But here I just tell the manager IAT is a task of the type time, its name is the IAT, and the file that defines what happens in the task is iat.js. And I'll show you that file in a second. Just let's see a little bit more here. If we go to the bottom, we see api.addSequence. Here we define the sequence of the study. And you can see every time. So we start with another type of a task, and that's the task post. You can post variables to the server, so the server will keep them. If you remember, in params, we saved the condition, dummy condition in this case, but many times it will be an actual condition, and you would like to save it because you need that in your data. You need to know what conditions the participants were. So it makes sense to start sequence with type post. And here I just put the name, and I think that means that we'll see it in a file called name, called manager, sorry, mgr, which is my abbreviation of manager. And then you can see that the next task in the sequence is use this inherit, which means you inherit the task, and that's the task called consent. So if you go up, you can see that here we define the task called consent. That's the name of the task here, but really it's that's the point where we define its name later for the inheritance. And it's a questionnaire. We call consent and it uses the file consent.js. It's really just a questionnaire that we use in order to ask participants, do you agree to take the study? If they don't agree, we redirect them again to be assigned to another study. Have anything else to tell them, to do with them. And then here's the code for the redirection. So again, I'm not getting into well, I guess you have learned a little bit about mixers. So you see that's the mixer branch, which means we might start doing here something, but it's according to conditions. And we're just checking whether the response to the consent was true or false. If it was false, only then this condition would be true. If people did not consent, if the response was I do not consent, then we redirect them. And here are a couple of more tasks that we define above in this file, and they will redirect participants to another study. And then we show them the commit page that I showed you earlier, the introduction, we call it here real start, and I explained why we call it real start also in my previous lecture. And here randomly, we have another mixer, that's the mixer random. And this is the data of the mixer random, which means that you will present with this task. Study will present randomly one of two blocks, either this one or this one. Well, it will present both of them, but in random order. And what you can see here, that's another mixer, a mixer called wrapper, which means that they are both wrapped together. It's important because what we have here, we define 5 different tasks. We define, going to use different tasks. Task inst x, which is the instruction of the explicit questionnaire. Here's explicit, which is the explicit questionnaire. That's one wrapper. And the other one is has 3 tasks. These are 2 pages that instruct participants, provide some instructions about the IAT, and then the IAT. So these are 5 tasks, and if we have all of them under the mixer random, then random might have just show all of them randomly, which would be odd because you might see the IAT and then the instructions to the IAT. So you want to make sure that the randomization is only of 2 blocks. So with this mixer wrapper, we say always show inst x before explicit, and always show inst IT, politic, and IAT, these 3 tasks, but show them in a random order. So that's the idea here. And you can read more about it when you read about mixers. And here, what I want to do is just teach you a bit about the IAT. So here is the IAT task, and we're going to go now to the IAT task. And so if you look at the left, there are a few different files, all the files that are used. You see here, every time I'm going back to in the manager file to api.add tasks set, which is where we defined all the tasks. You can see that most of the tasks, they have file. See that they have script URL. Script URL, it's a variable that defines where the script of that task is, and it's always here. Like we always put it in the same folder of the study, and these are simply the file names. And let's look at the IAT again, and the file name for the IAT is iat.js. Very inventive. So let's go to iat.js. And here it is. That's the file for iat.js. And that's supposed to be a time file, but what really happens here is that I am going to use a file that I already created. That's the it8.js file. That's a very complicated file that implements an IAT, actually uses Minno time in order to create an IAT. And I program that file. I will show it to you. You know what? Let's see it right now. So I hope that you can see it. And that's a very long file. It's a very long file. It's the file that I use to create an IAT that is very flexible. Like you don't need that many lines in order to create an IAT with Minno time, but you do need that if you want to allow other people to use it to run whatever IAT they want. So let's see how it happens. So what happens is that in that file, in the out file, like in iat8.js, I have defined a function called IAT extension. And if you run that function, and I think that at the end of the script, no, even here, we're running this function. We run a function called IAT extension, and what you see in this parentheses is the parameters that we send this function. And those parameters are really all the parameters we need in order to define an IAT. So that's what you're going to change. And also when I use my IAT extension, I use it here. I change all those variables if I want. And it's written with a data structure that is called JSON. And JSON is a data structure in which you can define a bunch of different things. So for instance, you can define objects. If you define an object, then you get this in those, how do you call those curly brackets? Just a second, let me see. So curly brackets. Let's see. Yeah, curly brackets or braces. People call it braces, some people call it curly brackets. Okay, I'm back here. So here I define the category one. It's, you know, an idea. It's two categories. So you can see here category one, and here is category two, and here is attribute one and attribute two. Now, these objects, they have a predefined structure. So they always have name, and they have title, and this media, which is either the images or words that you use. And that's other stuff that you can, that's the style of the stimuli. So you can change the font size and the color. So you don't need to know everything here. Usually you just copy that and then you change whatever you want to change. So if you want either, instead of calling it Democrats, you want to call it Democrat politicians. So you can choose like that, you know. So I just changed it. But that will be only the name that will appear in the data, and that doesn't make much sense. But if you want to change the title, here we define the title. So here it is. Now I have here comments that explain. So now that's the name of the category presented in the task, and you can use it. That's the style of the category title. So you can change only the style of the category title. You can change the font size and the color, also the height. And the height is important because you can even use an image. You can use an image and you can define the height of the image as the title. And then the height might change. And we need to know the height because, you know, in the critical block in the IAT, you have Democrats or good words, for instance. So we need to know where to position the or, and for that you need to define the height. In general, if you just see that your Democrat's title somehow covers the or, then you just try 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever. Usually you don't need that, but as I said, perhaps if you're going to use an image, then you might need to change the height, so you wouldn't cover the or. Okay. Now the next thing here, you can see that these two categories are defined, and also the attributes are defined. And here I also defined just one more thing, and that's where to find the images. Remember, like in the manager file, let's go back to the manager file. We defined in the global, remember we had API.add global, and we said base URL and we put the base URL here. And that's simply the images folder that we have here. All right. So we need to tell the IAT where to find the images, and we do that with this parameter. There is base underscore URL. That's how I defined when I created the IAT extension. I created this variable base underscore URL, and my IAT extension uses that. You know, that's the URL of the images. You just need URL for the images, don't need URL for anything else. So that's just the way we defined it. And if you want to change it, you need to change it here. So these are the kind of things that you will always want in your IAT. You always want to define the categories. Well, perhaps not the attributes. Let's see. Let's go to the IAT extension. Now, the IAT extension, as I said, is a very complicated script, and you don't need to understand everything about it. The only person who might understand it is me, and even I don't always understand it because some other people also made some changes there. So you can see here in the what happens is that from here below, so here we set settings of our task. Read the comments to learn what each parameter means. You can also do that from the outside with a dedicated JSP file. That I don't remember what it means, but in any case, here are all the things that you can define. For instance, you can add this object here, canvas. You can just add it here, and then you'll change something. But what is this canvas? Now, it doesn't say. But in general, you can use it in order to change the background, in a bunch of other things. It's really just what the IAT, what it's about the background of the IAT, really. But we don't need it here. So let's go back. Let's go back to the IAT file. And what you see here is the category, you see? So the default category, if you're not going to define a category, it will just have black people as a category and names of black people, which means that even if you just delete categories from here, there will be categories in your IAT. That's the default category. And every time you want to change the default setting, then you need to add that to your own file that uses the IAT. So, as you might guess, category 2 is white people. What I want to show you is that attribute 2 and attribute 1 are good words and bad words. So in general, you don't need to define attribute 1 and attribute 2 if you just want to use the good words and bad words that we're using here. But it's not like we chose the best attribute words here. They're good enough. We used them for a long time. I think in the demonstration studies, like years ago, these were the words that we have used. So you can keep it, it's fine, but you can also override it like I did in my script. I did override it with good and bad, but the words are different. Words that I prefer for some reason or another. Okay, but if you and here's the base URL that we also used. You can see here a bunch of other stuff that you can change. So for instance, and usually we have comments that explain what you can change here. So, you know, that's the number of trials in the attribute blocks, which is the second block, right? And number of trials in the categories block. And everything is explained here in comments. You can also decide, for instance, whether you want to randomize the side of the of the attributes. By default, it's not. We do not randomize it because, well, I tend to believe, I don't think I have data to support it, but I tend to believe that it's better to have the negative attribute category on the left because people are righties. So by default, the attribute categories are not randomized. Random block order decides whether you start with, you know, first category 1 is with attribute 1, of course category 2 is with attribute 2, and so on. And usually we randomize the block order between participants. And there are a bunch of other stuff here. Let's see whether there's, you can change the or doesn't have or, perhaps if you have a different language that you want to use, and also the style of the or, and something about the instructions. I don't know what that is, and what to write at the end. And also we have variables specific for if the IAT is a touch IAT, then we have slightly different text for them. And I think that we also have, let's see, is touch. See that the variable is touch. If you put true, then it's a touch IAT, and it will be adapted for touch device. So that's really the gist of it. You can see a lot of stuff here, and here it ends. And if you want, if one of you wants to learn how the IAT is programmed, you can continue doing that. Really not recommended. Oh, you can change. You see here the variables that you can use to change the feedback participants receive at the end. It's just a template of the feedback. Also the error messages, if there are too many errors, too fast, and so on. And a lot of this stuff is really just to allow people to create IT in their own language. And also the instructions. So you can also change the instructions. There are default instructions that Brian Osek and Emily, forgot her name, last name, but Brian Osek was involved in changing instructions. It's instructions that Brian wrote years ago, and that's pretty much it. You can change a lot of stuff, but that's all that you need to change. And as I said, just change it here. You can add those parameters here if you want to change anything. Now, what else that I want to show you? It's really just that, see this link? That's the link we use, we define. Now you see it here? That's the link that we're using to define that, we want where they can find the IAT extension that I wrote. And it's somewhere else. It's not on our dashboard. It's somewhere, it's on a CDN, which is supposed to be a website that helps speed up the download of files. So here it is. Here it is in the CDN. And that's the whole file. That's fine. Now, that comes from, sorry, here, comes from here, from GitHub. So GitHub is a website many people use in order to save their code for free online. A lot of people, other people can use it, and also other programmers can ask to join your project, and then they can change stuff. You can see here are folders. I created a folder for each extension implicit measure that I have. So I created implicit measures for the brief IAT, the IAT, the AMP, verifying SPF, and single target IAT. One of the important things that we might have here is the see here implicit measures MD. That's the README. So how to use implicit measures. So it explains all that I explained to you here is explained here in this file, and also it has an example for each of the existing extensions. There are 6 extensions, and they are all here. And also, I think an example for the instructions, but I haven't looked at that one for a long time, so perhaps it's not up to date. But these are up to date. So if you look at the extension, that's just the extension, right? But here is an example how to use, and that's it's pretty similar to what I showed you, but without the definition of the attributes. Remember, so it means that it's going to use the default attributes, the good words and bad words that appear in the IAT extension. And we have that for, as I said, for a lot of different tasks as well. So let's see for a second. Here's the example for the validated priming. Here's the extension, and here's example how to use. And you can see this it's the same idea. Like we have these parameters that we change here. So because it's an validated priming task, and assume that you know remember what validated priming is. So we have the prime categories. So we have here 2 categories, but we can have more than 2 categories. And also the images of those categories. And just as before, if you want to know all the parameters that can be defined, that you can define when you use validated priming, then you can just go here, let's say, and you can see right at the beginning there is EP opt, and here are all the variables that you can change. For instance, the number of blocks, how many trials for each category target combination, and more and more. Of course, I don't expect you to remember everything right now. That's the key rule in this, as the basic rule in this workshop. So, you know, if you're not sure how to use something, you can email the forum if you want to know how to use it. And you can also, if you think that it might not interest, it might never help anyone else, then email me directly or someone in your lab that you think has more experience than you. I guess you can also email anyone who you feel comfortable contacting, but you can also email. Okay, so I think, was that all that I want to show you? Oh no, so in my lab, I have a few undergrads who just, they work from just programmers in my lab. And when they have time, I ask them also to help Project Implicit. And what a few of them did is to create a user interface for creating IAT scripts. So you can create here an IAT script and change stuff. So it's really just create the same file that we saw with all the parameters, but here you could just use this menu. Now we haven't tested it much, but we have tested it a little bit, and people have been using it because what you could do here, see here, one of the things is that you can say, I want it for Qualtrics, because the script for Qualtrics is a little bit different than the script for the dashboard. So many people have been using it to create scripts on Qualtrics, and that's been good for us because they find problems all the time. But we haven't used it yet for the dashboard. So in a couple of versions, we're going to add this to the dashboard, and then people will be able to create the IAT without code. Well, it will use that node to create the code. So just so you would know, and even now, the link for this one, to this file, is in our main workshop document, and you can use it. Okay, so that's all I wanted to show to talk about.